بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم نحمده ونصلي ونسلم على رسوله الكريم أما بعد. Hope everyone is doing well, and this is our lesson 15 inshallah, in which we are discussing just concluding our lectures here on the topic of taqleed. So we said we have spoken about ijtihad. Last lecture we spoke about taqleed, and we kind of summarized the issue of Salafiyya, modern debates of taqleed, in light of the thought of the scholars like Sheikh Albani, and how the ulama have traditional scholars have reacted to that, in terms of saying that we need to reinstill the authority of the madhabs, and the general public are not meant to be engaging in evidences, rather to take away authority and allow the general public to engage in evidence. There are many pitfalls to that. Now, of course, the spirit of what is being argued for, in the sense that many Muslims may be engaged with taking people as authorities, and that can lead to cult-like behavior, no doubt. So an element of critical thinking is important, but the idea of dismissing 1,000-year scholarship based upon some sort of hadith that you think suggests to the contrary in a very simplistic fashion, that is uncalled for. So we did touch upon that. Now, the question that was remaining, and that's what we want to kind of touch upon now, is that I did mention some books that were written by scholars discussing the topic of taqleed and ijtihad, like Ibn Salah's book Adab al-Mufti wal-Mustafti, and as I mentioned, there's tens and tens of books on this topic, and many books of usul al-fiqh also talk about this. So the question now arises is that yes, we can accept that the general public are not meant to be engaging with evidences or doing tarjih based on evidences, and if they do that, it's more or less quite meaningless. We're talking about even people that are not even students of knowledge. The fact that they say this hadith is more authentic or this position is more authentic, and then dismissing other positions, that tarjih they did will not be given any weight. But now the question comes is then, what is a layperson meant to do? Right? Are they meant to follow a madhab if they're doing taqleed, or can they just ask anyone? And if there's different opinions, how are they meant to do tarjih? And amongst them, is basing upon evidence one such method or not? So that's what we're going to be dealing with, inshallah, in this lecture. Right. So let's break this down, inshallah. Is that you are now left with a layperson, an ami, and we, in our last segment of lecture 14, we spoke about in the era of the Sahaba and Tabi'un, the layperson was following authority, but they were not bound to any given authority. Right? So you follow authority, but you're not bound to any given authority, or not legally bound, where if any issue comes up, then you can go to a specific scholar and then seek from them an answer. But there was a pitfall in that, and this is a pitfall that some of the early ulama realized, is that when there is no legal restraint on a person, or no restraint, forget legal, just no restraint at all, this does allow people to select positions which would make their Islam, or make their or pick this way, they will pick positions that will fulfill or would provide ease, but facilitate whatever they want to do. So there are statements, I believe, from Imam al-Awza'i. If you look at the book The Legal Status of Following a Madhab by Mufti Taqi Usmani, it's available online, you'll find some of these quotations that Mufti Taqi Usmani mentions. One, the likes of Imam Awza'i saying, well, if you to follow the scholars of Medina on the topic of musical instruments, then that would be halal. If you follow the scholars of Kufa when it comes to the definition of khamar, then a lot of potentially intoxicant drinks will be halal. If you follow I forget the full quotation, but the point being is that you start to select these kind of positions from various geographical locations or ulama, then he goes zandaqa, you become a heretic, right? And the reason being is because the purpose of the believer is to try to do what Allah and His Messenger want from them. So whenever a case comes forward, I want to know, what does Allah want me to do for this? But when this approach starts to take place, remember, we are mukallaf beings. When this approach takes place, then we've kind of removed the taklif, the responsibility over us, and rather our hawa starts to dictate what position to adopt or not adopt. So that did become an issue and was noted. I don't know if it became an issue, but it was noted by ulama saying, this is something that you should abstain from. Right? This does not translate into now having to, so you don't find them saying in this era that you are legally bound to one person in all and every case, or one geographical location in all and every case. But there was some form of warning that this is your decision, but make sure that you do not fall into this trap. Right? So that's that is a fair, and the later on you see the discussion of this kind of gets merged with the discussion of talfiq. So we'll discuss that inshallah in a moment. Now, at that era, so if you're a person living in that era, you're not bound to any madhab, bound to any scholar, but you usually will have your ulama, your mufti of your region, and that's who you will go to. If he's a qadi, then there's not really issue, because the hukm of a qadi, that's final, it's mulzim, is binding. Right. Now, you get the schools of thought, right? So you get Imam Abu Hanifa, Imam Malik, Imam Shafi'i, Imam Ahmed, and other imams, and they have kind of delivered a whole range of opinions and fatawa, which have then been codified. So we're just going to skip a few centuries to the 4th and early 5th centuries, the 300s and 400s. Right, what happens in between is more or less similar to what's happening in the era of the Sahaba Tabi'un, that there isn't any clear still the madhab lines are being formed. So you'd assume that the lay person is still kind of navigating from mufti to mufti of the region, but there is no legal restriction upon them to stick to any one. But now, once we get into the 4th and 5th centuries, where these madhabs are becoming codified, especially like the Hanafi and the Maliki school, and to some degree the Shafi'i school, then the madhab lines become quite clear. It's quite well known the Hanafi positions, it's quite well known the Shafi'i positions, quite well known the Maliki positions. So even though there may be certain intricacies of debate or discussion, it will be quite well known what the Hanafi position of Jam' bin Salatayn is. It will be quite well known what the Shafi'i position of Tartib in Wudu is. It will be quite well known that the Shafis have a position when it comes to touching non-mahram or woman in wudu, depending on the position you take. But there is a position there, and the Hanafis are known for their position. So we can see these kind of dividing lines, and so scholars are now more or less working within the framework of a madhab before them, right? So there are still some other madhabs that survive quite late, like the Zahiri madhab survives quite a while. We even have other figures, scholars that attribute themselves to, but they're becoming very few and far in between. So for our purposes, you have people that restrict themselves to one of the famous madahib. So therefore, a lay person will also start to be adopting a certain madhab when they go to ask a question. So you have to go and say, right, I've got a scenario, let me go to the Hanafi Mufti, or I go to the Hanafi Mufti, I go to the Shafi'i Mufti. So lay people then also have this kind of very loose attachment to these madhabs, because they are clearly adopting a madhab's position. So it's not just a scholar amongst many scholars, you're going to have a madhab which is representative of a whole range of scholars, right? So in the era of if you're living in the time of Imam Abu Hanifa, you ask him a question, Imam Abu Hanifa represents himself, Sufyan Thawri represents himself, Ibn Abi Layla represents himself. But by the time we get so you have a whole range of scholars that you can ask. But when you come to a madhab, there's going to be, this is the Hanafi madhab, so you have a select range of a position that you can adopt. Of course, things get more complicated, as you see later, when the madhab itself may differ. But for now, for our purposes, you start to have a loose affiliation to a madhab for the layperson. Now the question comes about is that the layperson, must they adopt a madhab? Do they have a madhab? And if they do, what is binding upon them? Are they bound to their madhab or not? So this is a question that you start seeing usulis, right, from the 5th century usually onwards. They start to discuss this phenomena of lay people. Are they meant to be following madhabs or not? Now, the simple answer, the one that we can understand quite simply, if you understand how we discuss the era of the Sahaba Tabi'un, is that many scholars throughout the madhab, which is interesting, have said throughout the 4 schools, you'll find scholars that hold this position. They say, look, in the era of the Sahaba and Tabi'un, a lay person was approached with the phenomena of various scholars holding various positions. And there was no one telling them that you are legally bound to stick to one scholar. So if I was in the era of the Sahaba, as I mentioned this scenario last lesson, and I say I follow ask Ibn Abbas radiallahu anhu in a given case, there's nothing that is legally binding upon me to stick to Ibn Abbas in any other case, right? So therefore, once I follow Ibn Abbas, I'm free in any other given issue, or even in that issue, to ask others and adopt that. There's nothing which is binding upon me, but what is binding is that, first of all, dhikr is to ask someone because I have to follow authority if I'm not able to do so. I do taqleed. That is what we can agree upon, but so now that time has changed, the individual figures now are representative by madhabs. So the lay person, right, just like a person by far asking Ibn Abbas doesn't become the follower of Ibn Abbas and everything. If a person goes to a Hanafi mufti and says, what's the ruling of X? What's the ruling of Y? And they give an answer, there's nothing that binds them legally to the Hanafi madhab. So they can, in that case or in another case, we'll talk about some tafsil here, they can go to another madhab, right? Or another mufti who happens to be from another madhab and say, what's the case here? What do I do? And they will give another fatwa and they can adopt that, right? And this is where this phrase comes along, which is called, or which is known as al-aami la madhhab lahu. The lay person doesn't have a madhab. Madhabuhu madhabu muftihi. Their madhab is the madhab of their mufti. So whatever their mufti has adopted, right? So whoever they've gone up to and said, Mufti Sahab, what's the ruling here? And they say, this is the ruling. That's their madhab. If they were to go to a different mufti, different answer, different madhab they follow. They are not legally bound to any given madhab, and they don't actually have a madhab. And that's why you see scholars like in the Hanafi madhab, Imam Ibn Humam, rahimahullah, and other scholars have mentioned this, that the lay person, the madhab is for someone who understands the complexity of how the madhab operates. Right? So that only works for the student of knowledge within the madhab. That ascription makes sense. A lay person's ascription to the madhab means nothing. Right? A lay person's ascription to a madhab means nothing. So they are allowed then to go to whichever madhab they want to. But that warning still remains. Right? That warning still remains, which is the fact that what we mentioned in the time of the Salaf as well, was that this doesn't allow you then to just go and pick and choose whatever's easier. So someone may object and say, well, what is there to stop them from doing so? The answer will be, what was there to stop them in the era of the Salaf? Right? It's just putting that responsibility upon them, saying, you follow that which is you do not follow your hawa, but there could be other factors involved which may result in you choosing a madhab. Okay, we'll touch on this point inshallah in the next segment, in terms of if it's not based upon your madhab affiliation, what other factors can be involved for a layperson then to do tarjih. What I mean by this is, if I'm following the Hanafi madhab and I don't know evidence, so then, I ask a Hanafi scholar gives me an answer. Then I go to a Shafi scholar, and Shafi gives me a different answer. So I'm going for the Shafi madhab. So the question may come is, if that taking the Shafi position is not based upon hawa, then what is it based upon? Can there be other factors? How do these scholars who say al-amila madhhab lahu, how do they respond to that? We'll touch upon this and a few more issues in the next segment, inshallah. Okay. So before we move on quickly, because I'm mentioning a lot of things and we don't have the time to reference everything. So I mentioned a number of books. One of the books I did mention, but I said I forgot the title or the name of the author. This is available online. It's a 3-volume book, so it's quite large. And there's a lot of other discussion in there, but the points that I'm mentioning you'll find referenced in here, as well as this other book. So this is called التمذهب دراسة نظرية نقدية. The author of it is الدكتور خالد ابن مساعد ابن محمد الرويتع. Right, it's in 3 volumes. التمذهب دراسة نظرية نقدية. If you write that in Arabic, you'll see the soft copy of it come up. I've got a hard copy of it here in my home. So a lot of the points that we're mentioning is not because I'm just speaking, you may think that I'm theorizing from myself. No, these are actual responses given by usuli. So every point I've mentioned, unless I say otherwise, are actual points mentioned by usulis. Al-amila madhhab lahu, the argument of in the times of Sahaba. This is not my arguments for them. These are arguments mentioned in the classical texts of the books of usul al-fiqh. You'll find many scholars alluding to these opinions. So the last thing was we kind of left off in the last segment was that this objection that if the tarjih is not based upon dalil, because they can't do that, then and you can't do it based upon hawa, what other options are there? What other options that these scholars would mention for the layperson is that the layperson doesn't look at it through the lens of a madhab. So they look at the muftis as individuals. So for them, the scholars or the muftis' madhab affiliation doesn't really matter. It's just the mufti. So if I go to a person and say, what's the ruling on X? What's the ruling X? And the Sheikh says it is mustahab. And then I go to Sheikh B and I say, Sheikh, what's the ruling of X? And the Sheikh says it is makruh. Now, which one do I take? Now, of course, an easy option for the first following a madhab would say, well, take the one that coincides with your madhab. But these people are not accepting that a layperson has a madhab. They just look at it as individuals. Madhab means nothing to them. So therefore, they would do some form of tarjih. Now that tarjih could be based upon ma huwa aysar. So in that given issue, you may think this one facilitates ease. So it's not really hawa, but it facilitates ease. You should do that. Some would say you should do that which is ahwat, what is more cautionary. So if the one that's more stringent, in this case that if it's makruh, or I don't know what the scenario is, right? But I'm saying you go for the more, whatever's more caution. Number 3, and this is the one that I think usually kind of is more convincing, is the one that you say is more a'lam. So you as a layperson make a judgment call of who you believe is more authoritative or competent. So this can be based, of course, you don't have the ability to make that decision yourself if you're a layperson, but you can do so based upon a person's following, you can do so based upon a person's CV, or how well they cite their evidences, etc., right? And so therefore you can do tarjih between them based upon what who you perceive to be more a'lam. And there are some scholars who allow the tarjih to be done based upon what you think is more correct. So it's not, you won't call it ijtihad in the sense that you're going giving fatwa on it, but there'll be some form of critical analysis that you think, I think what this person is saying is more correct. So it actually gives the layperson a bit more ability to engage, right? So of course that requires some sort of ability to discernment or critical thinking from the layperson, and that doesn't always work. So from these scholars who adopt this, they'll probably say, tell the person to follow the one that they trust, who they think is more a'lam. So that's what their tahri, their initial investigation will be. So that's how they would expect the layperson to operate. But there is a pitfall, because more than, and this is the majority position, there are some scholars that have even allowed the person to follow whatever's easy and there's no problem. Like Ibn Humam, he says that just you actually, it's no problem in following dispensations. The Tatabu Rukhas, that person can actually go forth and seek dispensations and act upon that because the deen is easy. This is it's a minority qawl, and the reason why it was objected to or rejected was because it takes away the taklif upon the Muslim. And the second thing that most scholars consider, even if you're not abiding with the madhab, and this is what makes things sometimes a bit tricky, is that a person should abstain from talfiq. Person must abstain from talfiq, and this is what most scholars have opposed. There are scholars even within the Hanafi madhab that have allowed talfiq. Talfiq, it comes with laffaqa yulaffiqu. Talfiq is where you join 2 positions together, but in our context, for our benefit, is 2 positions that are contradictory. So like the example that you may have heard many a times before is that, let's say a person he does wudu and he starts to bleed, so that means in the Hanafi madhab his wudu is broken. But then he says, I follow the Shafi madhab where bleeding does not break the wudu. After that has happened, he goes and he happens to touch a woman, and so now his wudu, same wudu, is broken based upon the Shafi madhab. So now he says, I take the Hanafi position. In that circumstance, what's happened is that the camp B, which says they must adopt a madhab, is clearly problematic straight away because you adopt a different madhab. But camp A will also have an issue with that, who allow going through different scholars or different madhahib like this, is that you've ended up with a wudu which neither the Hanafi or the Shafi would accept, because the Hanafi wudu is broken because of the fact of bleeding, and that same wudu is broken from the Shafi madhab because of touching a woman. So therefore that wudu is batil bil ijma'. So talfiq needs to be one needs to be careful of, and so in essence, to kind of facilitate this, you'll be advising to someone to stick to a madhab when it comes to encouragement, but it would not be binding. There's more. There's something which is called talfiq fil usul, which the Indian scholar Alam Anwar Shah Kashmiri spoke about, but we don't have time to kind of engage in all the intricacies of that. But for our purpose, this is sufficient, I would say, to describe position A. So in summary, you're not bound to, the layperson is not bound to a madhab. Al-amila madhab lahu. Rather, they will follow the authority, whoever they want. It should be based upon some form of discernment, so a person who's more a'lam, and one should stay away from following hawa and looking for dispensations, and they should avoid talfiq. If those things can be avoided, then there is nothing legally binding for a person to stick to a madhab. So a layperson saying they're Shafi'i or Maliki means nothing. They can, hop around, if I can use that term. And so you have scholars, as I mentioned, like Ibn Humam, and there's lists of scholars who've held this position. Imam Shumbulali in the Hanafi madhab, Abdul Ghani al-Maqdisi in the Hanafi madhab, it's Abdul Ghani and Abulusi, in the Hanafi madhab. And then in the Hanbali madhab you have people like Ibn Taymiyyah, Ibn al-Qayyim, and numerous others, not just these, numerous others. In the Shafi madhab, if I'm not mistaken, I think Ibn Salah, and there's a massive list. I'm just going to go off the top of my head. If you check the book up and other works, you'll see even Shah Waliullah holds this position as well. Now, on the other side, right, is the position that there is a shift now. That once the madhabs are formed, a layperson must adopt a madhab, or once they've adopted a madhab, they are legally bound to stick to that madhab. And there's two main ways in which this has been formulated. So in this we'll mention one way. The last segment we mentioned the last way, and we'll kind of detail a bit of that inshallah. The first way, and this is where you find a lot of classical Hanafi usulis mentioning as well, is that the initial adoption of a madhab, right, or adoption of a madhab. And by the way, this first position kind of assumes that there's going to be an initial process in when a person adopts a madhab. So there has to be some sort of like, okay, I'm a Hanafi, and by you saying you're Hanafi, it's either you've done it or it's assumed within the statement that you have done tarjih based upon the Hanafi madhab. So you've done tarjih that the Hanafi madhab is the most correct. So now, in your lens as a Hanafi, you believe the madhab is rajih. So this can either be by actual investigation, so this could be by looking at the history or looking at who the authorities are or some positions, and the layperson made a judgment call saying the Hanafi madhab is correct. So you've done some form of tahari. So now the Hanafi madhab becomes rajih, the preferred position, and every other madhab becomes marjuh. It becomes weakened, the lesser preferred position. So now the Hanafi scholar, the layperson now, it means for them that everything in the Hanafi madhab for them is rajih and everything else is marjuh. And it's not allowed for a person to follow that which is marjuh. Right? If I, for example, if something is presented to me and I say, this is what I believe Allah wants from me, this is what I believe Allah does not want from me, it's not allowed for me to follow that which I believe what Allah does not want from me. I have to follow what I think Allah wants from me. I mean, the rajih. So by you saying you're a Hanafi, you've accepted that whatever is in the madhab is rajih, so everything is rajih, therefore that's what Allah wants from me. and every other madhab that where we oppose is marjuh. Therefore, once a person does iltizam, that they've adopted a madhab, it's not allowed for them to leave that madhab. Right? It's not allowed for them to leave that madhab. How sound is of a method or usul that is to establish the legal the binding of that is questionable. But for our purposes, that's argument A. Right? That's argument A. And again, you'll find Hanafi scholars like Ad-Dabusi, others have mentioned this argument, and you'll find many other Hanafis also adopting this. And this also works on the premise that not all mujtahids are correct. If you believe all the mujtahids are correct, there's no idea of rajih and marjuh, all are correct. So because Ahl Sunnah adopt the idea of one being correct and the others being wrong, therefore once you've done tarjih, the other positions become wrong. قول مذهبي سواء باحتمال خطأ وقول غير خطأ باحتمال سواء. Now, moving on to our last segment, the second method of argumentation for the obligation of sticking to a madhab. So remember, right now, more or less, the scholars that discuss this all talk about the obligation of taqleed. Right? For the layperson, the obligation of taqleed is not something that has really been disputed. You may find odd positions here and there, but generally speaking, there's, not just the ulama, but I'm saying just practically speaking, it just makes so much more sense anyway. But so everyone's talking within this realm of taqleed, is just showing, is debate, and to be honest, those who usually say that the layperson doesn't have a madhab is actually diminishing the status of the layperson more so, because it's saying that you don't have even the ability to adhere to a madhab. So your level is so low that you don't even know how a madhab operates, so your adherence is not even qualified. So it's not that it's giving the layperson some sort of freedom to do analysis. That's not really what the notion of those scholars who advocate for that. Anyway, the second way that this has been advocated, and this is alluded to in the writings of Ghazali as well, but it's more famously said and argued for more forcefully in the Indian subcontinent. We have scholars such as Mufti Sadruddin Azurda, who was a teacher of Maulana Rashid Ahmed Gangohi. You have Maulana Abdul Hayy Lakhnawi. You have scholars like Maulana Rashid Ahmed Gangohi. And it wasn't just a Deobandi thing, that's why I mentioned Abdul Hayy Lakhnawi. Mufti Sadruddin Azurda becomes before Deoband. There's also what we know as proto Brelvis, so the people that become before Maulana Ahmad Raza Khan, such as Ghulam Dastaghir Qusuri. These scholars push for a notion of what is known in the Urdu Farsi language as Taqleed Shakhsi. The fact that it's binding on a person to follow. Shakhs literally means a person, but it's understood generally as being a madhab. And their argument revolves around the issue of hawa. So it's like the argument of fitna. So remember before, in the earlier lesson, we spoke about the issue of niqab and how most scholars in the later times, when they argued for the obligation of the face cover, it was based on the premise of fitna. So they said because of fitna, it now becomes wajib. So a very similar argument was made to say that although it's not sexual fitna, but it's fitna of ignorance, people fatwa shopping, and there's a few other factors which I'll explain inshallah, that basically said that because people are ignorant, people don't know how they're following desires and so on and so forth, it's an obligation for every person to follow a madhab and stick to it, which they will call as taqleed shakhsi. Now in the Arabic language, this was known as taqleed muayyan and taqleed ghayr muayyan, or taqleed muqayyad or taqleed mutlaq, whatever terms you want to use. But in the Urdu Farsi language, the term was used taqleed shakhsi, and that's still used. You see a lot of in the subcontinent they'll talk about taqleed shakhsi versus taqleed ghayr shakhsi. So this taqleed shakhsi was argued because of the issue of fitna, and that it becomes wajib for a person to adopt a madhab. Now there's a reason why this kind of argument was used, and it actually worked quite a bit, is because in the time of, so when in the Indian subcontinent in the late 1800s, this is also the rise of modernist movements across the Muslim world, right, across the Muslim world, because of the fact that many of these modernist movements that were doing away with authority. So therefore, if a person, the notion is that if I say to a person that, oh, you can follow whatever authority you want, doesn't really matter, madhabs etc. don't really matter, then in essence you're giving license to all these other figures to give their positions and give them equal authority to the layperson, right? But if I push the fact to the layperson, no, you have to adopt a madhab and stick to it, it preserves the person to some degree of following valid positions. And this does make sense, right? So if you're living, let's say, in the late 1800s or the early 1900s in India, and so if I'm being told, I don't follow madhab, just follow whoever scholar you trust. But the problem now is that there is no scholarly class. The knowledge has been democratized. So anyone and everyone can be speaking about knowledge and giving fatwa. So it's not, if you kind of push that back 200 years and say, follow whatever scholar you want, the scholars were more or less known. Yes, there were some qussas, etc., but the scholars were known. There was a scholarly class. So if you kind of picked a scholar from amongst them, you usually would be staying within the spectrum of the Sunni tradition. But if you said to a person now that, just follow someone that you trust, right? The fear it was, and the fear is for many scholars, is that, well, these people that you're going to follow, many of them are not going to be following any madhabs. They might even be scholars, right? At least if you have a madhab, and that's what you are saying, okay, what you said is just a Hanafi madhab, at least allows a person to have some sort of anchor that holds them down and allows that consistency in fatwa, and the person can be relatively safe. So within that spectrum, there was this push for many of the scholars, and the Deobandi scholars were very, although they did not originate from the Deobandi scholars per se. As I mentioned, there was Mufti Sadruddin Arzurda that comes before Deoband established, and he's actually from the teachers of Mawlana Gangohi and Mawlana Qasim Nanotwi. They talk about Taqlid Shakhsi, but this is where this kind of Taqlid Shakhsi was that emanated from. So this position does have its worth. There are obviously, doesn't solve all issues because of the fact that intra-madhab differences are there. So it doesn't just become that you follow the madhab, you have to then follow the mu'tamad of the madhab, and therefore the layperson requires a bit more awareness of what the mu'tamad is, and that becomes impractical again. So there isn't a clear answer on an absolute correct answer on this. There is some vagueness here. How to navigate through this, Allah knows best, but it kind of really depends upon the nature of the layperson, because it depends on the nature of the layperson we're talking about. Let's put it this way: a lot of the students or people that are going to college, universities, that are part of Islamic ISOCs and these kind of halaqas and doing charity work or whatnot, but they're not students of knowledge. Their approach to Islam or following opinions will be quite different, because they usually have the understanding of a spectrum of positions, different ulama. So what they do and how they operate will be a bit different to, let's say, someone who, let's say, they have an aunt or a mother or a grandparent who've kind of lived their whole life, not really being aware of scholarship, what that means. They don't really understand what a madhab is. So for them, their Islam has been what their local imam has taught, or the local speakers, or nowadays whatever they put online. So the nature of their Islam would kind of vary. And to try to teach everyone madhabs and its authoritativeness is very difficult and quite complicated. So there is a spectrum of positions here. And what I would say is that a person should, if you're a student of knowledge, you adopt a madhab, no problem, right? And for the layperson, they should be advised in accordance to their knowledge. So sometimes a person clearly struggling with other issues, the least of their concern should be to know what a madhab is, etc. Rather, if you can see someone that they have someone knowledgeable in the area, just say to them, follow that person, right? Or follow this mufti, or follow that alim, and you stick to it. Right, you don't have to make it legally binding on them. And in other instances, you may want to, if there's a place where there's a lot of fitna and groups and sects that people are exposed to, so it might be better to push the madhab to say, make sure that you adopt the madhab, because Sunni tradition is based upon madhab. So that way, when that layperson kind of asks the person the question, say, okay, by the way, what madhab is this? If they turn around and say, well, no, we don't follow madhabs, or we don't care what madhab's got to say, then you can kind of be sure the layperson that this is not the Sunni tradition you're following. So you can kind of mitigate that problem. Okay, so this is this position of Taqlid Shakhsi has been argued for by Mufti Taqi Usmani, and I'm saying many books, right? Mufti Taqi Usmani's book in translated English as well, The Legal Status Following a Madhab. That's his position there. Now, like I said, these are not, definitive arguments. You can always object to, and of course any argument which is based upon fitna, there's always going to be some leeway there, because context change, times change, and so on and so forth. So hopefully that kind of clarifies some of these debates. I've given you sources and material to look into that you can spend some time looking at. And the topic of taqleed and ijtihad, there's a whole host of positions out there, elaborations on there, that I think the sources I mentioned will be sufficient therein for one to navigate through. Once this is understood, hopefully now the dynamics of the way the taqleed versus ijtihad debates kind of maneuver should hopefully be more clearer to us, so we can kind of navigate through these ideas with some more clarity. And also it kind of also shows that the position that some Salafis, not although as I said the tides have changed in more recent years, but the famous Salafi position of the layperson trying to understand what Bukhari is or following what Bukhari is, that how far away this is from the tradition. The classical debate of taqleed mutlaq versus taqleed muqayyad, or taqleed shakhsi versus taqleed ghayr shakhsi, was very different to what this current debate of lay people reading Bukhari is. So inshallah, hopefully that is clear. So in conclusion, now with this we'll kind of conclude with our last 15 lectures, that we've in this very brief time period. It really feels very brief because we have a very short time frame to discuss topics which take hours and hours to kind of unravel and read through, etc. But I've given some reading, hopefully with highlights and positions that may not have been known before. So we've kind of got a bit more understanding, hopefully, of what was happening or fiqh before Imam Abu Hanifa. We learned a bit about the life of Imam Abu Hanifa, some of the controversies surrounding that, his students. We looked at the spread of the madhab, the two ways of success of the madhab. One was through politics, and the other one's through the students. We spoke about the institutionalization of the madhabs. I mentioned the paper of Yusuf Rappaport, which kind of explains how the institutionalization of taqleed came into being and what that actually meant historically. We didn't really move on to the Ottoman period because it's a massive arena, and we didn't have time to kind of navigate through that because it would be a whole separate series to kind of look at the scholars and what they did. We also looked at the issue of the taqsim al-mujtahideen, taqsim al-masail and taqsim al-mujtahideen, and how that affected the madhab. And then we did a number of case studies, like the issues surrounding women, the issue of taking fatwa from another madhab, and some other case studies such as the issue of women divorce, etc., for the writings of Ashfi Tanwi. And then we concluded our sessions with a discussion on the topic of taqleed. And so hopefully this kind of gives us a much better awareness of the madhab. We also looked at some of the key books in the madhab, the mukhtasars, the commentaries, etc., and their standing in the madhab as well. And we had a lesson on some of the methods of giving fatwa, and how a mufti, depending on their grading within the degrees of mujtahideen, how they are meant to give fatwa. So the difference between a mufti who is a mujtahid, a mufti who does some form of ijtihad, mufti muqallid, and their relationship with the madhab. And this would hopefully have been enlightening. If there are any comments or questions, etc., you can send them over to our admin team, and I'll be happy to try to respond. If there's any articles or books mentioned that you cannot get access to and you can't find them, then please don't feel any restraint in asking. I will inshallah provide them through the admin team. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.